So, shooting film is hard. And it's even harder if you're disorganized like me. So a couple weeks ago, I had this bright idea to go out and shoot all of the random expired rolls of film that I had lying around. And it didn't exactly go well. Before I even set off, there were a couple of pretty glaring issues that would basically ruin most of the photos I took throughout the course of that day. Well, first of all, one of the rolls that I brought along wasn't actually an expired roll to begin with. It was a perfectly fine roll of Ektar 100. And while that by itself wouldn't have been that much of an issue, the big problem was that two of the rolls I had already shot. So what I thought was going to be some cool photos of the sunrise and of the mountains turned out to be just a bunch of random double exposures. Now there were still a couple of decent photos from those double exposures, but more on that later, because the second major issue that I had before even leaving for this day trip was the fact that one of the cameras I brought along, my Nikon EM, the first film camera that I ever bought, the first film camera that I ever shot film on, was broken. Like, really broken. I don't know if it was a light seal issue or a shutter issue or a metering issue, but either way, most of the photos that I shot on the Nikon turned out something like this. But going back to those accidental double exposures, there were still some pretty cool ones, like this one, for example. Because the tones on this one actually look pretty good, and the little bit of dry grass that I took a photo of at sunrise adds a nice little bit of texture to the background of this photo. And I think more importantly, the reason why this double exposure actually turned out okay is the fact that you can actually make out a subject in this one, and you can kind of see what's going on in this scene. There's just kind of a little bit extra going on. So I think this one is actually pretty decent compared to some of the other ones that came out. Now this photo, which was originally supposed to be this little shack on the side of the road that was just being lit up beautifully by the morning light, kind of turned out to be just this messy amalgamation of pretty decent looking light but no real discernible subject. The lighting was just phenomenal, and you can see a bit of that coming through in the bottom left corner of the image. But unfortunately, whatever other photo this one was taken on top of just kind of adds a bunch of extra texture and mess, and unfortunately covers up the subject of the photo, which was intended to be that cool little rundown shack by the side of the road. So after a morning of driving around and aimlessly taking photos and stopping at every possible gas station in search of a half-decent breakfast burrito, I found myself in Netherlands. And it was here that I would finally find that breakfast burrito. The lady at the counter definitely overhyped this one a little bit. Nothing that a couple of dabs of hot sauce couldn't fix. After that, I made the pretty bold choice of leaving the warmth of my car to walk around in the middle of a pretty newly brewing snowstorm. Pretty much all of the photos I took here were ruined by the accidental double exposures. Except for this one, I guess, which is a somewhat decent photo of the reservoir. It's just not particularly interesting. And it was about at this point that I learned heavy winds and a relatively light and top-heavy tripod don't really mix. After pretty frantically wiping off the front of my lens and getting some of the feeling in my fingertips back, I decided it was time to just drive aimlessly around the mountains. After kicking those first 2 rolls, it was time to load some new ones in. And this is where some of my luck would start to change. First, in my Nikon, I loaded up a roll of Bright Aid 200, the holy grail of all films that had expired back in the early 2000s. And the Canon AE1 got a roll of some pretty generic looking 800 speed film. And then it was time to get back to civilization. And by civilization, I mean Golden, Colorado. This is where you can say I made my 3rd mistake, because for some unknown reason, I decided to park at a trailhead outside of town and walk into the town of Golden, even though there were freezing hurricane force winds blowing. Now that my fingertips were somewhat thawed out, it was time to thoroughly freeze them through again. I did at least get some decent photos of this frozen river. Out of the photos that I took on this walk, there are 2 that really stand out. The first one is this photo that stands out because of what could have been. The lighting was absolutely phenomenal on this little mountain peak, and the Nikon failed just enough to give me a sneak peek of the photo that could have been. Compositionally, it's kind of boring. It's just a picture of some mountains in the bottom 2/3 with a blank sky in the top. But the lighting is so fantastic, it's good enough to be the subject here. And if the Nikon hadn't failed, I think this would have been a pretty good photo. Luckily, the second photo that stood out from this walk was this one, which compositionally, it is pretty fantastic, and it's amongst the best ones that I took that day. While the lighting isn't quite as dramatic on the mountains in this one, I think the contrast that it created with those shaded trees makes the mountains look pretty imposing off in the distance. And the trail does a pretty good job of leading your eye up to the only other person that was crazy enough to be out walking at that time of day. Overall, this photo gives off a pretty solitary, moody vibe, and I quite like it. And that brings us to the actual town of Golden, where I walked around taking some pretty generic looking photos. Eventually I found myself in front of this beautiful little liquor store with a wonderfully retro sign and paint that looks like it came out of a Route 66 photo book. It was here that I took this photo, which might be the single best photo from this entire day. I think the colors actually work really well with the expired film, and there's a perfect amount of lens flare. The composition itself is also pretty darn good, and thankfully this was the one photo that my Nikon didn't fail for. And I'm really glad it's this one. This one might actually be print-worthy. After some more walking and shivering, I found myself in the middle of this little old cottage town that I can only assume was the original settlement in Golden. But I didn't read the brochure, so that's just my best guess. The expired 800 speed really came through here. Photos that I took with it came out pretty solid, and even though I was pushing the 800 speed by one stop because it was expired, it still looks pretty darn good. Of all of the photos that I took at this specific spot, there is one that stands out above the rest, and that's this one. The minute that I saw how the light was shining through these windows, I knew I had to take a picture of it. And I think this is probably my second best, maybe the best photo. The way that the light is splashing on the floor fills in that negative space on the left really well, and the light through the window does an excellent job of drawing your eye up to the windows themselves. And somehow, even though this was 800 speed, expired in 2010, and pushed by one stop, it has enough dynamic range to capture the inside of the classroom and some detail in the windows as well. For me, this one is pretty close to the best photo of the day. It's definitely between the liquor store and this photo. I just don't know which one sends the right message. The liquor store or the classroom? This wind is absolutely brutal. After visiting this little town, I was thoroughly tired and cold, and all I wanted to do was go home. But I still had almost an entire roll left to shoot. So on my way back to the car, I decided I was just gonna shoot absolutely everything. Most of it wasn't entirely interesting though. Like, why would you waste 2 exposures taking the same photo of bark? You'd have to ask past me, and past me didn't have an answer either. There were 2 shots that had some pretty decent potential, but unfortunately they didn't turn out quite how I envisioned them in my head. This first one, I visioned a panorama-esque kind of framing with the fence boards on the top and the bottom. And while the framing of the fence turned out pretty well, the scene that I shot in that frame is just kind of boring. It's just some sticks in a field. There's no real reason to look at it. But the second one, the actual scene itself has a ton of potential and intrigue. That little creek created a beautiful leading line up towards that well-lit butte off into the distance. The only problem was I was an idiot and didn't frame the lines straight. So now it's not exactly a panorama style framing, it's just kind of crooked. But by this point I was too tired and too cold to spend the requisite amount of time framing up to this shot. So if the opportunity arises, there's something there, but it just needs to be executed better next time. Before I could completely call it a day, there was one more spot that I wanted to hit. I've always called this place the land of lonely trees because, well, there's a lot of just singular trees strewn about. I'm sure it has some official name like Flatirons Vista or something, but I'll forever know it as the land of lonely trees. My only mistake here was bringing the Nikon. Even though most of the shots I took here with the Nikon were completely ruined, it was nice enough to give me one usable photo that I think does a pretty good job of explaining why I call this the land of lonely trees. Surprisingly, 50 millimeters was enough to adequately enlarge the subject here, and the mountains peeking out along the horizon do an excellent job of drawing your eyes towards the tree in the center. And there's just enough clouds in the sky to make it not look bland and boring. This one at least takes the cake for the third best shot that I took that day. So after all of that, what did I have? 3 pretty decent shots, a handful of useful ones, and a whole mess of completely ruined ones. And maybe some memories along the way, I guess. But I think the real takeaway from this little day trip is that shooting film is hard, and it's gonna take me some practice and consistency to get consistently good results. But I think the most important revelation is that it's finally time for the Nikon to come full circle. I bought this camera off Craigslist for 50 bucks almost 10 years ago. And for the first 3 years it spent in my possession, it served no purpose besides being a decoration on my shelf. I shot my first roll of film using it. And it was on this camera that I learned the hard way not to open your camera with film still loaded inside of it. This camera came with me to my honeymoon. And now it's finally time for it to rest and return to its rightful place on my shelf. Oh, and I also learned to label the rolls that you've already shot. Yeah, I don't know how I didn't think about that already.